Have you ever stopped to think about what truly shapes our societies, our daily interactions, or even these major global events? It's often far more intricate than just, well, simple commands or visible displays of might. We're talking about something really foundational, something that influences every single one of us, whether we realize it or not.
Indeed. It's like we live in this constant web of influence, right?
Yeah.
Layers upon layers that kind of dictate how decisions are made, how groups interact, and how change or resistance to it actually unfolds.
Yeah.
Understanding these hidden layers is absolutely key to being truly well-informed, I think.
That's exactly why today we're taking a deep dive into one of humanity's most fundamental dynamics, power. And we're pulling from a really rich stack of sources for this exploration. We've got profound philosophical insights like those from critical theory and the groundbreaking work of Michel Foucault, sitting right alongside historical accounts of nonviolent campaigns, the immense global process of decolonization, and the essential concept of intersectionality.
So our mission today is really to unpack these sources, pull out the most important nuggets, and help you grasp what power really is.
Yeah, how it works.
Exactly. How it functions, how it shaped human history, and crucially, how it can be challenged and maybe even transformed. We're looking for those surprising facts and profound insights that really help you connect the dots.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Let's try to understand the essence of power.
Yeah.
Because, like you hinted, it's so much more than just a simple threat or, brute force.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how the definition of power goes way beyond mere physical coercion. At its core, it's the ability to influence or direct the actions, beliefs, or conduct of others.
Right.
And this isn't always overt, it can be exerted through very diffuse means, like the subtle workings of institutions themselves.
So it's not just about a leader giving orders then. It's almost like it can be woven into the very fabric of society, operating quietly beneath the surface.
Precisely. Power can take structural forms, which basically means it orders actors in relation to one another. Think of historical examples like the master and enslaved person dynamic, or even a modern employer and employee relationship. But it also has what we call discursive forms.
Discursive.
Yeah, discursive. It refers to how categories and language can legitimize certain groups or behaviors over others. So when a particular group gets labeled undesirable in public discourse, that's discursive power at play. And when we talk about authority, we're usually referring to power that's seen as legitimate or socially approved within that structure.
That makes a lot of sense. And speaking of radical shifts in how we think about power, we absolutely have to talk about Michel Foucault. His approach really turned traditional understandings on their head.
Oh, completely. Foucault's work didn't aim to analyze power itself, which he thought could lead to these metaphysical traps, getting bogged down in abstract definitions.
Right, getting lost in theory.
Exactly. Instead, his goal was to trace a history of the different modes by which, in our culture, human beings are made subjects. He was less interested in what power is or where it comes from, and far more focused on how it's actually exercised.
So he wasn't looking for one single source of power, but rather the actual mechanisms, the ways people become subjects, how their identities and actions get shaped. How did he identify these mechanisms?
Well, he discussed 3 powerful modes of objectification that transform humans into subjects. First, there are these modes of inquiry that strive for scientific status.
Okay.
For example, in linguistics, the very act of studying language can objectify the speaking subject, kind of defining what it means to be someone who speaks. In economics, studying wealth can objectify the productive subject, how we define ourselves by our labor, maybe. And in biology, examining life itself objectifies the sheer fact of being alive.
That's a lot to chew on. Can you give us maybe a more everyday example? How does linguistics objectifies the speaking subject? How does the way we study language actually change how we experience using it or how others see us when we speak?
Well, think about the rules of proper grammar, or even how different accents are perceived. The study of linguistics, while it aims to be descriptive, can also sort of contribute to norms that then influence how we speak, what we consider educated speech, or how maybe a dialect gets associated with a certain social standing. The very act of categorizing language can end up shaping our linguistic identity.
I see. So just studying ourselves and the world can actually shape who we are and how we're seen. Okay, what was the second mode Foucault identified?
The second mode he studied was dividing practices. This is about how individuals get divided, either from themselves or from others.
Dividing practices.
Yeah, think of the historical classifications like mad versus sane, sick versus healthy, or even criminals versus good citizens. These aren't just neutral labels. They actively shape people's identities, their experiences, societal roles, often leading to exclusion or confinement.
Makes sense. And the third mode?
The third is the way a human being turns themselves into a subject.
Mm-hmm.
Foucault's work on sexuality is a prime example here. He looked at how people learn to recognize themselves, or are sort of made to recognize themselves as subjects of sexuality through various discourses and practices.
Right.
The core insight from all of this, really, is that power operates as an action upon an action. It acts on existing actions or those that might arise. And this is where it's really interesting because it implies this constant dynamic rather than just a static thing being imposed.
That's a complete paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Seriously, if power isn't fixed, but it's always acting on what we do, what does that tell us about our ability to resist? Does it mean resistance is like inherently part of power, two sides of the same coin?
It absolutely suggests that, yeah. If power is about influencing free individuals, people who could act otherwise, then the possibility of them acting otherwise, recalcitrance, is built right into the very definition of power. It's continuous, dynamic negotiation.
Fascinating. Okay, so with that theoretical foundation laid, let's look at power in action. When we talk about power in its most concentrated form, we often think of authoritarian regimes.
Right. In authoritarian regimes, political power is highly concentrated. It's in the hands of a single leader or maybe a small group. And since these leaders might not be elected by a majority, their main threat often comes from the masses, right? So to maintain control, they employ various tactics, ways to influence action and prevent resistance.
What are some of the key ways they keep their grip? What do the sources say?
Well, they use overt repression, obviously, directly targeting challengers to their beliefs, which can be done through violence or, locking people up. They also rely heavily on indoctrination controlling public education, using propaganda to spread their views and values. Our sources mention that just a one standard deviation increase in pro-regime propaganda can actually reduce the odds of protest the following day by 15%.
Wow, 15% just from propaganda. That's striking. I hadn't fully appreciated just how directly shaping thought could reduce protest. Does that mean it's often like a more effective long-term control tactic than just brute force?
It can be, yeah, because it aims to preempt resistance by shaping the very framework of belief, They also use what's called coercive distribution, providing welfare and resources to keep people dependent, maybe offering benefits to those they think they can manipulate.
Okay.
And then there's infiltration, where state agents go into grassroots levels to sway public opinion and report back on any dissent. This often connects to what's called power politics that drive to enhance governmental power, frequently involving this romanticized view of military virtues.
And when you scale that up, the grandest historical exercise of power has to be colonialism.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Colonialism was this incredibly pervasive system, primarily European empires controlling vast lands, exploiting indigenous peoples and resources, all for raw materials, markets, even religious conversion.
Yeah.
Between 1492 and 1914, European empires conquered over 80% of the world's landmass. Just think about that for a second. That's almost the entire globe under the thumb of a few powers.
That's an astonishing amount of control. It feels almost insurmountable when you put it like that. So what finally brought an end to this widespread system after World War II? It wasn't just one thing, was it?
No, definitely not. Several factors converged. Economically, many European powers were just bankrupted by the war. They simply couldn't afford to sustain their distant colonies anymore.
Right.
Post-war agreements also played a big role. For instance, Japan, being on the losing side, had to renounce control over 200 million people in its empire as part of a 1951 peace treaty.
And then, of course, there were the independence movements themselves. They'd been simmering for a long time, but they finally found their moment.
They really did. Long-standing independence movements gained incredible momentum. Some, like in Ghana and India, used these widely popular nonviolent protests, which proved remarkably effective.
Yeah, Gandhi.
Exactly. Others, places like Kenya and Vietnam, fought long and bloody wars for their freedom. And finally, international pressure was significant. The founding of the UN in 1945 gave a vital forum for newly independent nations to denounce colonialism. That led to a UN resolution in 1960 that passed without opposition.
But gaining independence was really only the first step, wasn't it? These newly independent nations faced immense challenges, often inheriting the very problems the colonial powers had created.
They certainly did. Many emerged with very little political experience. The Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, had never even held an election before its independence.
Wow.
Guinea faced destroyed infrastructure. The French recalled all their personnel and reportedly destroyed public buildings, files, leaving the new administration with almost nothing. It was a deliberate effort, really, to hobble their new autonomy.
That's incredible. And the borders.
Yeah.
The borders that had been drawn by colonial powers must have created lasting internal divisions.
Absolutely. These arbitrarily drawn borders often completely ignored local realities, existing ethnic or tribal lines. This led to internal conflicts that, sadly, persist to this day in many places. Economically, many former colonies were set up just to export a few raw materials. That made them highly vulnerable to global market swings. Mali's economy, for instance, collapsed in 1973 when oil prices shot up, crippling its ability to export gold and cotton.
Right.
And then, on top of all that, there was the Cold War, which created new proxy battlegrounds. The U.S. and Soviet Union fueled conflicts in newly independent nations like Vietnam and Afghanistan, just furthering the instability.
It sounds like the fight for independence was just the beginning of a whole new, incredibly complex set of power struggles. Okay, so with power operating in such complex ways, how do we effectively analyze and maybe transform it?
That's where something like critical theory comes in. It's a social, historical, and political school of thought that really centers on analyzing and challenging systemic power relations.
It's challenging that.
Yeah, the core argument is that knowledge and truth themselves are fundamentally shaped by power dynamics. So, to understand society, you have to understand who holds power and how they use it.
So it's not just about observing society from afar, but actively working to change it. Is that right?
Exactly. Critical theory has an explicit aim to transform society through what it calls praxis.
Praxis.
It's that vital combination of theory with action. It originated with the Frankfurt School back in the 1920s with thinkers like Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse. They expanded Marxist analysis to include things like psychology and culture. Later, figures like Habermas shifted the focus towards communication, and then postmodernists like Foucault and Derrida further challenged notions of objectivity and truth. They profoundly influenced critical theory, even if they weren't formally part of the Frankfurt School itself.
Okay, that brings us nicely to another powerful concept for understanding these complex power dynamics. Intersectionality. It feels like a really natural extension of critical theory's focus on systemic power.
It absolutely is. And what's fascinating here is how intersectionality helps us see that various social inequalities, things like race, gender, class, sexuality, they don't act in isolation, right?
Right.
Instead, they form this interlocking matrix of oppression or matrix of domination. This concept has deep roots, especially in the insights of Black women intellectuals like Anna Julia Cooper, who were emphasizing the interconnectedness of racial and gender oppression long before the term intersectionality was actually coined.
And the Combahee River Collective's concept of simultaneity. That's key here, too, understanding how race, class, gender, sexuality all happen at the same time. Can you give us an example of how this plays out in real life, where that interlocking nature becomes really clear?
Yeah, a really clear historical example is the 1976 court case, De Graffenried v. General Motors. Black women workers alleged they faced compound discrimination specifically because they were Black women.
Okay.
But the courts failed to see it because they only viewed race or gender separately. They basically said, well, GM hired Black men, so there's no race discrimination, and they hired white women, so there's no gender discrimination.
So they completely missed the specific discrimination against Black women.
Exactly. It highlights how these distinct forms of discrimination can be completely overlooked when layers of identity aren't considered simultaneously. It raises that really important question. How do we truly account for these complex, layered experiences rather than trying to fit them into neat, separate boxes?
Yeah, it really makes you think about how different policies or systems, even if they seem neutral on the surface, can affect people so differently based on how their identities intersect.
It does. And another practical application you can see is in immigration policy. Consider immigrant women who are victims of abuse by their citizen spouses. They might face this terrible choice: endure serious injury or risk deportation, because under some immigration laws, they couldn't divorce their spouses for 2 years if they wanted to seek permanent residency. Intersectionality helps shed light on how race, gender, and immigration status combine there to create these unique vulnerabilities.
Like a really powerful framework for understanding how theory can illuminate these very real-world problems. But okay, if power is so pervasive, what about directly challenging it? What role does nonviolent action play, especially when you're confronted with really concentrated power?
This is where Gene Sharp's insight is incredibly powerful. He argued that political power ultimately depends on the subject's obedience.
Their obedience?
Yes. If subjects simply refuse to obey, leaders have no power. This is fascinating here, because it puts the agency for change squarely in the hands of the people. It shifts the locus of power from the ruler to the ruled.
So it's not just some idealistic idea. It's actually a strategic approach rooted in history. Can you give us some real global historical examples of nonviolent action actually getting tangible results?
Absolutely. The sources list dozens, really. For instance, way back in ancient Rome, 494 BC, the plebeians, the common people, withdrew from the city and refused to work. That forced concessions from the Roman consuls.
Wow, 494 BC.
Yeah. And more famously, Mohandas Gandhi led India's independence movement from the 1920s to 1947 by organizing boycotts of British goods and widespread non-cooperation.
And during World War II, when the stakes were incredibly high, we saw nonviolent resistance then too, right? Even against the Nazis.
Yes, quite remarkably so. The Danish government adopted this policy of negotiation under protest after the Wehrmacht invasion. It involved things like slow production, celebrating Danish culture, subtle defiance. Norwegians engaged in civil disobedience to prevent the Nazification of their education system. They distributed illegal newspapers. There were similar efforts to save Jews through nonviolent means in Berlin, Bulgaria, Denmark, France. And then in the U.S., the civil rights movement from 1954 to 1968, ignited by Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. It masterfully used sit-ins, marches, freedom rides to achieve huge legislative changes like the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act.
And we've seen nonviolent action bring down entire regimes in more recent history, too. That's truly incredible when you think about it.
Yeah, many dictatorships have fallen to nonviolent civilian insurrections. El Salvador and Guatemala in 1944, the Philippines People Power Movement in 86, the swift end of communist dictatorships in Czechoslovakia and East Germany in 89.
Right, the Berlin Wall.
Exactly. Poland's solidarity movement through the 80s, the dismantling of South African apartheid over decades, ousting Serbia's Milosevic in 2000, Ukraine's Orange Revolution, the Arab Spring uprisings. It connects beautifully, actually, back to Foucault's concept of agonism. Agonism, this idea of a constant reciprocal incitation and struggle, where freedom isn't the opposite of power, but it's very conditioned and permanent support.
That's a truly profound thought. Freedom as the condition for power to be exercised. It implies that power always kind of contains the seeds of its own resistance.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for the ongoing dance of power and freedom in the world today?
Well, if we connect this back to the bigger picture, like decolonization, it isn't just a historical event that ended when the flags were raised,
Well, it still happens.
It's an ongoing process. Many former colonies still retain the colonial borders, the languages, even the religions that were imposed on them, and these continue to shape their societies today.
So it's about more than just formal independence. It's about shedding those enduring vestiges of the past.
Yeah.
It's a continued struggle for, true self-determination.
Exactly. You see countries actively pushing to reorganize along ethnic lines rather than those old colonial borders, like in Cameroon and Nigeria. Tanzania replaced English with Kiswahili in schools, recognizing language as a key part of cultural sovereignty. And governments like Benin, India, Mali are demanding the repatriation of artifacts stolen by former colonizers. That's a powerful reclamation of cultural identity and history. It highlights this continuous struggle to reclaim identity and autonomy.
And this brings us kind of full circle back to Foucault's idea that resistance is an inherent part of power dynamics.
Right. Foucault believed that power relations are deeply rooted in all social networks, and that, a society without power relations can only be an abstraction.
It's unavoidable.
Pretty much. Therefore, the analysis and the constant questioning of power relations becomes this permanent political task inherent in all social existence. Every attempt to intensify power, to make the insubordinate submit, ultimately reveals the limits of that power. Because freedom, that possibility of recalcitrance, is its very condition and permanent support.
Okay, so we've taken a really deep dive today into the multifaceted nature of power. We've looked at its theoretical foundations, its manifestations in things like authoritarian regimes and colonial empires, and the intellectual and practical ways it's challenged through critical theory, intersectionality, and nonviolent action.
Yeah, it's clear that power isn't some static entity, but a really dynamic force, constantly being negotiated. It's this ongoing dance between influence and resistance.
So here's something to consider. If power only truly exists, as Foucault suggests, when it is put into action, and if freedom is a condition for power to even be exercised, then what untapped potential for change lies in our everyday actions, in our refusal sometimes to just submit? What does this mean for your role in the ongoing evolution of power dynamics, not just on a global scale, but maybe in the communities and relationships closest to you?